been a pleasure for me today to get to know Dr. Jackson a little bit better. He has a strong spirit and a happy personality, and he has a lot of experience that he will be discussing with us and we can all learn from. Let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Jackson. He was born in the small town of Fremont, Wayne County, Utah, which I must confess I have not yet visited. So hopefully in one of my summer Utah excursions I'll visit Fremont. He attended Brigham Young University from 1953 through 1955 and graduated with high honors, earning a degree in history. He served a 3-year mission in Hong Kong and later served as the founding president of the Taiwan mission for 3.5 years from 1971 to 1974. In addition to studying at Brigham Young University, he earned an MA from the University of California, Berkeley in history and a PhD from Arizona State University in administration of higher education and business. He established international studies at Utah Valley State College and was the director of the Center for International Studies there for 10 years. He recently retired in 2000. He also taught international marketing at BYU. We are also very pleased to have his wife Linda here with us, who shared in some of his amazing experiences. And they have 7 children and 25 grandchildren. Oh, and 3 great-grandchildren. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Malan Jackson.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back home. Since I retired from teaching here, I just haven't gotten back very much. I did serve at the MTC for 5.5 years, so that was just about here. I enjoy walking around the campus. I see people I know. As I was coming in, I recognized the face, and I said, "I know you." He said, "Yeah, you were my branch president at the MTC." So it is fun. I so enjoy meeting people that I've known or worked with in the past. Asia has very much been my life. We will see that you get to Fremont, okay? It's on some maps. My hometown has all of 150 people, and it's still my hometown. We still have the family property there and the family home, even though my wife prefers to live in the city. So I'm good to her, and I didn't move back there after I retired. Let me ask you, how many of you have had Asian experience? Okay, several of you have. Taiwan missionaries, I suppose, Hong Kong missionaries, Japan and Thailand. I hope you know quite a bit about Asia already, and I hope you learn more. As we have seen, China is a major player in the international scene. They don't always play by the rules. Things aren't always going smoothly in China, but nonetheless, it's important, very important. When I went on my mission to Hong Kong, originally I was called to the Japan mission. 1955, there was one mission in Asia. That was Japan. However, when I boarded the ship, this was really the old days, I was met by President Joseph Fielding Smith, and he announced that he was going to Asia to divide the Japan mission into the Northern Far East mission and the Southern Far East. And I'll forever be grateful he asked me to go to the southern part, to Hong Kong. That was 1955. But that wasn't the first effort in Hong Kong. If you can imagine being called from the pulpit in the tabernacle in Salt Lake City in 1850 to serve a mission in Hong Kong. 4 men were called from the pulpit. I've read a transcript of that meeting, and with the call, the statement was made, "These will be short missions. We're calling you for only 7 years." The group of 4 set off for Hong Kong via San Francisco. One of them changed his mind, stayed in San Francisco. 3 went to Hong Kong. Hong Kong in 1853, it was 1853 before they got there, was only 13 years a colony of Britain and was a very difficult place for them. They could understand the British barely. They knew no Chinese. They arrived there in July, which is very hot and very humid, and they didn't stay. They caught the next ship coming back to the U.S. Hosea Stout, whom you may have heard of, he was a very prominent figure in the church, kept the one journal that we have. Another man who, surprisingly enough, lived in my hometown of Fremont also, Chapman Duncan, lost his journal. I searched for years, we never found out what happened to it. But again, that was the beginning. 1949, there was an attempt to reestablish a mission. Those of you who know something of Chinese history, Hong Kong history, know 1949 was the year that the communists took over the mainland of China and were marching toward Hong Kong. So the 3 missionaries in Hong Kong again left. 1955, we established the mission, and it has endured and is a very strong mission now. And as you should know, Hong Kong is again a part of China. So we actually have not only missionaries, but we have a strong church and a temple in China. When I went to Hong Kong, 1955, by ship, it was so different from the Hong Kong of today, as you can imagine. Some of you have been in Hong Kong, and as you get off the Star Ferry, the ferry that runs between the island of Hong Kong and the mainland, the Kowloon Peninsula, there's a clock tower. The clock tower is probably about 3 or 4 stories tall, and at one time stood at the west entrance of a railroad station. It's no longer there. But when I went to Hong Kong, that was the tallest building there. And now there are buildings of 80 stories and more. Our early years in Hong Kong were very interesting. We had no chapels. When I arrived there, we had no mission president. He had gone with President Smith to Japan. We went on to Hong Kong, found a place to live, and began learning the language, Cantonese. It was interesting. We finally found a good teacher. He was working in a furniture store where we bought our furniture for the apartment. But he spoke good English, and we were told his Cantonese was quite pure, so we hired Nga Heng to teach us. This man was one of our first baptisms. He didn't stand a chance. We were with him all day, every day. And as he taught us, we taught him. He later was a branch president, district president, a bishop, a stake president, area representative, the first president of the Hong Kong Temple. But the church has grown so much since then. I occasionally meet some of the old members. but that was a long time ago, 50 years ago. And most, if not all of those that we baptized then are gone. But Hong Kong was the beginning. It was new. Even here at BYU, there weren't many who knew about Hong Kong. I wasn't too sure about where Japan was even when I got my call. But I do remember a companion who, when he arrived in Hong Kong, I think expressed the lack of knowledge at that time of most people. When his call came, he was working away from home, and his grandmother was at home, and he told her to open the letter and call him, which she did. She says, "Well, I know that you wanted a foreign mission, but you'll be serving in the U.S." Well, okay, so when he went home that weekend, he opened the call, and it was to the Southern Far East Mission. And his grandmother, "See, I told you, you're going to Florida." That was as far south and east as she could see. But now let me ask you some questions. How many of you know very much about Mongolia? Where it is? What's going on there? We have 2 Mongolian sisters with us here today, and you have about 30 or 35 on campus, I think. Mongolia is a very important place. If you don't know where it is situated between China and Russia. And until 1990, Russia had controlled Mongolia for 70 years. The Mongolians invited them to go home in 1990. They've been struggling then to build a democracy, and it is a struggle. What about Kyrgyzstan? Do you know where Kyrgyzstan is? Where's Kyrgyzstan? Or Tajikistan? Uzbekistan? These are countries in Central Asia, an increasingly important part of the world, and increasingly important for the church. The church is established in Kyrgyzstan, quite strong in Kazakhstan, which are the largest of the countries in that Central Asian area. I've spent time in those countries. They're fascinating. But I want to talk about my experiences in the areas where we have spent more time. I've mentioned Hong Kong. We just kept going back. I was there as a missionary. We went back again with a bank, and then had a small business in Hong Kong. Hong Kong too has changed, as I said. It is so very different now. In 1971, I had just returned from Taiwan. I chose to do the research on a topic in Taiwan. That time, Taiwan was quite closely almost closed to research. But I got permission to do research of their higher education system. Chiang Kai-shek was still the ruler there. I say ruler, he called himself president. But we began the work of the church in Taiwan as a separate mission in 1971. We had actually sent missionaries to Taiwan from Hong Kong in 1956. When I went to Taiwan, Taiwan was a district of the Hong Kong Taiwan mission. We had the privilege of establishing a new mission, which was an exciting opportunity. Taiwan then was very different than it is today too. I remember the day they decided that Taiwan had outgrown pedicabs, the three-wheeled bicycle contraption with a two-seat passenger capacity above the back two wheels. That's the way we traveled. But the day they decided to change, all the pedicabs got a little yilong cha, a yilong automobile made in Taiwan. So we were there when they modernized. We were also there to witness 10 or 20 accidents a day. They learned to drive by experience. But Taiwan was exciting then. As you know, Taiwan was the refuge for nationalist soldiers primarily, and a lot of people who had to leave the mainland when the communists took over. So from the beginning in Taiwan, we taught people from every part of China. And those people were very receptive to the gospel. I never did meet the president. I had dealings with him. But to show you the reception that the church received, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, who was one of the Sung sisters, if you've read of China, a very powerful family. Another Sung sister married Sun Yat-sen, who was the founder of modern China. But Madam Sung was Christian. She had converted her husband. Now Madam Jiang. But she held a reception for foreigners living in Tibet. She sent us a reception with a note that I want to talk with you privately during the course of the evening. So we prepared a specially bound Relief Society lesson book and a Book of Mormon bound in white leather. And when we came through the reception line, there were a lot of people behind us. She and her aides were there. She just said, okay, let's go. She left the reception line and we went to a sitting room. She said, tell me about your church. And so we did. And we gave her the Book of Mormon, explained what it was. And then we gave her the Relief Society manual. And Madam Jiang thumbed through it and then with tears in her eyes said, this is so important to the women of my country. It was a very touching moment. She read those books. She supported us. It was a very important part of our work in those early years. Her husband also helped us. As I mentioned, Taiwan was still a police state in the early 70s, secret police, and it was difficult. We instructed our missionaries to never talk politics. In old China, they had signs outside the meeting places, the restaurants, that said, when you enter, do not talk politics or religion. But in Taiwan, we did talk religion. The district president, when we arrived there, was a very famous man in the church and in China. He was a painter, a well-known painter, Linton Bing. One day, he was to retire. He was a teacher, and he disappeared. I went right to the Minister of Justice, and by the end of the day, we had found him. He was in a prison, accused of having attended one meeting that was suspected communist when he was 19 years old. That was almost 40 years before he was arrested. And so I had contact with the president. It took us more than 2 years to obtain his release, but finally the pardon was signed by President Chiang Kai-shek. But during the period we were there, 3.5 years, we did see many changes. And there's no doubt in my mind but what those changes were a result of the gospel being taught throughout the country. So many people came into the church. Great people, great leaders. It was a good time. We enjoyed Taiwan. Our children learned Chinese. I remember on their National Day, which is October 10th, we were driving through the city, and there was a huge painting of Sun Yat-sen, again the founder of China. My little 5-year-old, who was in preschool in Chinese, turned to me and says, "Papa, 你看，这是我们的国父." Daddy, look, that's the father of our country. But I'm pleased that all of our children have lived in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and or China. The Taiwan years were good years. I must mention one man who deserves a lot of thanks and respect. You've probably never heard the name and may never hear it again. His name is Ivan Hall. Ivan was the purser on the American President's Line ships. He was working for them when we went out. He retired a number of years ago. But Ivan would pick up things needed here in the U.S. and take them to the missions in Asia. He would bring organs from Japan to Taiwan and Hong Kong, and then later on to Singapore. He would take carpets made in Taiwan to Hong Kong and Singapore, back to Japan and Korea. I think the most important service was he brought boxes of American food. The missionaries would stop by the office. "When will Brother Hall be here again?" And if they were lucky enough to live in his port, the port where the ship would dock, he had invited them aboard the ship for meals, which was a major celebration. Ivan is still living. He's in his 80s. We still visit him. But he was very important to a lot of us. Like every missionary who has served in Taiwan or Hong Kong, we could hardly wait for China. There was always talk of teaching the gospel in China, going to China as missionaries. We had the opportunity to move to China in 1985. Is that right? 84. I've always looked for any excuse to get back to Asia, anything. And so I accepted the position of as president of a sailing yacht building company located in Xiamen in Fujian province, just across from Taiwan. We were the only foreigners in the city. We took 3 small children with us. And we discovered that the factory just wasn't operating. It took them 6 months to build one yacht. So I did a lot of teaching, a lot of learning too. And we produced 1 yacht a month for the 2 years I was with that company in Xiamen. We were instructed, like people still are, even those going from the Kennedy Center, they were not to preach the gospel in China. We could answer questions. It was the same then. We were fortunate to find an old home on a small island that had been the center of Christian activity in China. The Christians went into China. The first were the Catholics, who went in as early as the 1400s. We thought they were the first. The Presbyterians went in 1805, the first. He was with the trading company, the East Indian Trading Company out of England. The missionaries followed the American gunboats as the Americans and the British would open a trading area, the missionaries would follow and would be protected by them. And the little island we lived on had been the center of American activity. The American consulate building still stood there. The Americans were driven out in 1949 when the communists took over the mainland. But we were fortunate to meet the old gentleman who had been the caretaker of that building and still was. When the Americans left, he said, "I will stay and take care of the building until you come back." Well, they didn't go back to that island. But we learned a lot about Christianity from the people on that island. The government allowed them to meet. This was in 1984, 85. But they were carefully supervised by the government. They were to teach what the government allowed them to teach. We attended church occasionally at the Sanitong, the 3-in-1 chapel. A lot of good Christians. These were dedicated people. We had close friends who would invite us to discuss the gospel with them. But we could not openly teach. We did share some reading material. I took quite a large number of Tabernacle Choir tapes back to China with me. Those years they could not buy tapes from outside, and we shared these with our friends. I'll never forget the night. I came home from work quite late. I'd ride a bicycle from the factory to a little ferry that took me across the island. I was walking on a narrow alley. They did not allow automobiles on the island. And coming from a hotel window, I heard the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. It was electrifying. Since they couldn't buy tapes, they recorded and shared. The tapes I shared went all over China. People in Shanghai later told us that they got copies. Even in the far west of China, they got copies. The people were hungry for the truth. They wanted to know. I think another very sweet experience. At that time, too, people were not allowed to do business. They could work for the government, but they could not have their own business. And for a Chinese person, that is sort of like a death sentence. They're business people. They love to do business. One night again, I was riding home, and a door was open, and I saw some antiques inside. So I went in, and there was an old man there. We chatted a while, and I bought an old clock from him. I started to leave. He said, "Would you please come back later tonight, maybe 10 o'clock. I want to talk to you." So I went back, and he very carefully let me in. We went up to a small apartment above the shop, and I met his wife and 2 daughters. We sat at a square table, chatted a moment, then he went to a cabinet and brought something wrapped in black velvet and laid it down on the table very lovingly, unwrapped it, said, "Do you know what this is? Do you know what this is?" It was a Bible in Chinese. And I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you Christian?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you think you could teach us more about Christ?" We talked a while that night. I had a copy of the Book of Mormon in Chinese, which I gave to them. They just devoured it, all 4 of them. He had been baptized young. His wife was a member. The girls, of course, hadn't been baptized. It was wonderful teaching them. It was a very spiritual experience. I helped the oldest daughter go to BYU, Hawaii. She joined the church there. There were people everywhere who wanted to no more. But we had to be so careful those years. Being the only foreigners, we were invited to teach groups of faculty usually. We couldn't openly say we're teaching you the gospel, but we did. Our talks to those groups were about the gospel. It was a very special time. We traveled in Fujian province, met people, again, who just wanted any opportunity to hear about spiritual things. We took the children one New Year, Chinese New Year, up in the mountains, to a town that had not seen foreigners in almost 40 years. We had a little blonde, blue-eyed daughter. We couldn't stop without a crowd gathering around us, scared her to death in the beginning. They had to feel her hair and look again and again at her blue eyes. But in that town one morning, we went to a park. We were waiting for it to open. A man rode up on, it was like a Taiwan bicycle. For those of you who were missionaries in Taiwan, it was rusty, worn out. He laid his bike down and came over very quietly, very humbly, stood by us until I greeted him. And then he said, "Are you Americans?" We said, "Yes, we're Americans." And then he said, 我们中国人非常爱美国人. We Chinese people love the Americans. Now this is almost 40 years after the communists took over and began telling everybody to hate the Americans. We talked to him a while, then he got on his bike and left. But he just had to tell us that the Chinese people love the Americans. We have a lot of friends in China in important positions who would join the church if they dared. A former cabinet member in Beijing. I brought many university presidents here for training. Many of them believe the gospel. We were grateful we could be there that early and share such an important part of what we know is true with those people. But just quickly, what's happening in China with the church now? I think there are about 10 branches for expats in China. I have a son living just outside of Shanghai, in Suzhou. They have their own branch now. There are 2 branches in Shanghai. And Chinese who were baptized abroad and got a foreign passport can meet with them. Chinese who were baptized abroad but did not get a foreign passport before they went home cannot. However, a few years ago, the government began allowing them to hold their own meetings. And so now we have groups, little branches of Chinese all over China. We have a brother living in Beijing, a retired Chinese brother, who has Canadian citizenship, Brother Jia, who's the area representative and travels to all of those branches. 2 years ago, the government informed them that they could baptize family members. Also, about 2 years ago, the leaders of those groups went to Hong Kong to be endowed in the temple and to be trained by Chinese leaders there. I really had no idea how extensive these little branches had spread. I knew they're in Xi'an, which is a major city, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou. While I was at the MTC, we received the first missionaries from China. We can't do missionary work there, but they sent missionaries here to be trained and to serve in the U.S. A few months ago, my wife and I went back to the MTC and met a Chinese girl. I spoke with her in Mandarin. I asked her where she's from. She said, she's from China. I said, where in China? She said, Kunming. Now, those of you who know China, Kunming is a long ways away. Kunming was the China terminus for the American planes that flew from India over what they called the hump, or the Himalayas during the Second World War. It's in far South China, in Yunnan province. And I said, how did you find the church in Kunming? She said, well, my mother went to the States on business, met some missionaries, knew that it was true and it would be good for me, so she was baptized. And she taught me. I said, do you have a branch in Kunming? Oh, yes, we have a large branch. It's exciting. It is so exciting. As you know, the Kennedy Center does send many couples to China each year. They do so much good in China. You wouldn't believe it had you seen what we saw, that there are branches of the church in China now. We helped the young ambassadors, other groups come to China, to cities we lived in, to Guangzhou and to Xiamen. Elder Worthland came with a group of them. I'll never forget one night sitting with him on this small island. There's a beautiful little Catholic cathedral there. He and I went to that cathedral late in the evening and sat down and talked about China and the Lord's work there. And he saw, as I saw, what's happening now. We've enjoyed China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. But now, Mongolia is my life. And when you get involved with Mongolia, it is your whole life. I was invited to Mongolia in 1992 by the first ambassador to the United States from Mongolia. He came through Utah. We had the opportunity to meet Ambassador Nyemdo. He and I talked. I knew a bit about what was going on in Mongolia. The church was not yet established there. The church was begun, well, actually we sent humanitarian missionaries first in 1993. But I asked Nyemdo what we could do. He said, help our young people. He said, we have a lot of young people who have no idea what life is about. When the Russians left, they left a severe vodka problem behind them, and that has affected the young people in Mongolia. So he asked me if I'd help them with their education programs. And I said I'd do my best to help. I went to Mongolia with I was on the same plane actually with the second group of our humanitarian missionaries who went there, 1993. Talked with Nyemdo, and over the years have worked with, I guess, maybe almost 300 students individually to come to Utah to study, including Nyemdo's family. Nyemdo passed away with cancer a few years ago. I was with him in Mongolia, but his family live here in Utah now. And many of these young people have joined the church. I meet students that I had at UVSC who were interested in the gospel but weren't baptized there, and they're just so thrilled to tell me that they've joined the church. One day my wife and I were on Temple Square. There's nearly always been at least one Mongolian sister there. And walked up to the sisters, and one of them was Mongolian. the daughter of a government official that I brought here in 1994 when she was 16 years old. But she had not only joined the church, but now she was a missionary. The church in Mongolia has grown so rapidly. What, 7,000 members now? Pardon, 8,000? About 8,000, yeah, between 7,000 and 8,000 members. And at one time, Mongolia had sent out more missionaries, or had more missionaries in the field, per capita church membership than any country in the world. I remember when I was in the branch presidency of the branch at the MTC that received the Mongolian missionaries and also trained missionaries to go to Mongolia. We had 27 missionaries from Mongolia at one time. We don't have many anymore because too many of them would go home, come back, and then not go back to Mongolia. So now they send them to Japan and to Europe, but still a lot of missionaries going out from Mongolia. I challenge you to learn more about Mongolia. It's a fascinating country. The church is growing rapidly. We built a number of chapels there. We have built the most beautiful building in Mongolia. We have a 5-story church center near the largest hotel, the Genghis Khan Hotel, almost in the center of Ulaanbaatar city. A beautiful gray polished granite building. And the church is growing. The president of the mission was one of my missionaries in Taiwan, formerly an Area 70 out of Hong Kong, President Anderson. Before the Mongolian mission presidents were called for 2 years. When Elder Anderson was in Area 70, he suggested to brethren that 2 years wasn't long enough. The brethren said, it is. It's a hardship post. He recommended 3 years. So when they called Elder Anderson to be mission president, he moved from a beautiful home in Hong Kong to Mongolia, where he will live for 3 years. The first 3-year mission president. We love Mongolia and the Mongolian people. They're very, very special people. And the members of the church are so dedicated. And this in a country, when I say Mongolia, you'll think of one person. Who is that? Genghis Khan, yes. And you remember Genghis Khan for doing what? Conquering the world, the known world. And they didn't do it gently. As they rode with their armies across Central Asia, they would come to a city, give them 2 choices. You surrender now, and we will spare you. You don't surrender, we'll destroy the whole city. That's the way they worked. In my reading, however, I discovered that there were some cities that were spared anyway. And then I was done just a few years ago. I found a book that recorded the fact that a number of Genghis Khan's generals were Christian. And so, or their wives were Christian, excuse me. The generals were not, their wives were Christian. And so they'd convince their husbands not to destroy a city if they knew it was Christian. Why were they Christian? In 1825, a group of Franciscan Catholic missionaries were digging the foundation for a cathedral in Xi'an. This was the China terminus of the Silk Road. They uncovered a large stele on which was recorded in Chinese mostly, but also with some Persian, the history of a missionary, the Chinese transliteration is Aloban, who had come from Persia He was a Nestorian Christian in 626, had come into China and had proselyted there, and the Nestorians also went into Mongolia. So they had churches all the way through Central Asia, in China, and in Mongolia. They have long since disappeared, but this was the beginning of research on Nestorians in China and Mongolia. But then there are those other countries. Kyrgyzstan. Kazakhstan, I have been there. The church is growing quite rapidly in Kazakhstan. We have approval in Kyrgyzstan. It's a much smaller country. But again, these people are wonderful people, very anxious to know more than what their leaders have allowed them to know. Kyrgyzstan is unusual. Stalin used it as a destination for groups of people he didn't want in Russia, other parts of Europe. They'd be sent to Kyrgyzstan. When I was there, I met Jews, I met French, I met Germans, I met Russians, but also a very fertile field for the gospel. In Tibet, we likewise found people very interested in the gospel. I don't speak much Tibetan, but the Tibetans now speak Chinese, unfortunately. But we talked with many of those people. They too had questions about Jesus Christ. Have you ever heard of the city of Urumqi? Urumqi is the capital of which province? Xinjiang, in the far west. I've been there a number of times. I've brought some of the Uyghur people here, and they've joined the church. There we found signs of the Israelites. They've uncovered tombs there in that dry sand, and I've seen mummies that are dressed in Israeli clothing from hundreds of years ago, many hundreds of years ago. So that is an area of the world that has known Christianity, has known the teachings of the Jews as well, that now is very rapidly receiving the gospel. It's been fun being a part of it. And I was happy to go when I did, when it was still what the local people had built and not what America was making, not becoming too Western. We have time for a few questions. Again, I thank you for this opportunity, and we'll try to answer any questions you may have.
We have a mic for our questions so that we can be on the podcast. I hope this is working. So if you have any questions, can you please let us know, and I'll bring you the mic. I think one of the questions I have, Dr. Jackson, is for those students who are perhaps interested in going into international business, who know Mandarin, who perhaps see China as being a potential expatriate destination for them and their families, what advice would you give?
Do it. Start with the library in the Tanner Building, the Marriott School of Business. There you can find companies that are well situated, mostly in Shanghai, but also in Beijing. And they're looking for people. Or get a bit of experience in business here, then go out there and do your own thing. I have several of my return missionaries who have started their own companies out there, and they're doing very well. Many others working for major international firms, and they're doing very well. But do it, and the information you need is available there. Yes?
I have a question, which is, I'm interested in Chinese language, even though I don't speak any Mandarin or Cantonese. But eventually I plan to study just because China is
Yes.
Mongolia is in the north of China. So and Chinese, like being able to know and speak Chinese is very important. So do you know any Mongolians who did that, like in the national business, who learned Mandarin or Chinese language and go there and work?
Yes, I have known quite a number. They're in Mongolia. The leading expert in Chinese passed away this year, or last year. He did his research on China-Mongolian relations, but he was the person I'd recommend you to, but we lost him. There are others there. Tsen speaks some Chinese. They have learned it in Mongolia. But do learn it. It'll be very important to you for many reasons, and you can learn it right here. They have one of the better Chinese programs in the country. Yes, they do. And they have good teachers and good classes. Linda?
And there was that school in Beijing where they studied Chinese?
Yes. There's a girl living here in Utah, Alta Tsetseg, who speaks perfect Chinese. Her father was the military attaché in Beijing, and she learned Mandarin there. Yes, but learn it here. This is a good place to do it. Thank you. Any other questions?
Time for one more question.
Yes.
I'll just be really loud.
I do appreciate a few questions, because if there aren't any, I'm worried, you know. Maybe you're not interested, or maybe you didn't understand what I was talking about. Yes.
We do a little bit of study about the Uyghur Autonomous Region up there in Urumqi.
Yes.
And aren't they mostly? Isn't that people mostly Muslim?
The Uyghurs are Muslim, yes.
How does the church interact with that, and when the church is growing there?
Extremely well. If you're interested in that part, afterward let me give you, well, I'll get your email address. And I'll send you the name of a Uyghur who lives here, a scholar who has been baptized since he came.
That would be excellent.
He was Muslim, but he and his family are members of the church now.